Philippines, and welcome to the World News Jam here on DZRJ and RJTV. My name is Eric Lecain. I'm here to talk to you about some of the interesting stories that happened this week, to update you as to the things that are going on outside the Philippines. We're currently taking a little break from our normal format as I will be doing some traveling, but I'm still here this week to take you through some of the biggest current events going on in the world. In the U.S., there are many monumental points in history where we think back to what we were doing when that happened. If you were older, well, it was where were you when Kennedy was shot? And then where were you when 9/11 happened? But now, where were you when the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, the women's constitutional right in the U.S. to have an abortion? Well, remember, because it just happened. This Friday, June 24, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court did something that no one ever thought that they would do in the U.S. to take away a woman's right to choose whether she wants to carry a baby to term. The reason this is so monumental is because, really, of the main divide between the Democrats and the Republicans, two of the most prominent issues in any election have always been guns and abortion. Now, the Democrats, for the most part, outnumber the Republicans in the country, and, well, those two don't really agree on anything. However, on this issue, many Republicans believe in a woman's right to privacy and can decide for herself if she wants to terminate her pregnancy. In fact, somewhere between around 2/3 of Americans believe in a woman's right to choose. And for the most part, the Supreme Court has been made up of representatives that matched the U.S. population. That is until Donald Trump came along. Now, usually each president will get to pick one Supreme Court justice if he lasts for 2 terms or 8 years. But the Republicans kind of cheated Obama because when it was his turn to pick, they refused to even have a hearing because they were in the majority of the Senate. The tactic worked for them because when Trump came into office, he was able to pick 3 justices in just one 4-year term. Now, it's become very well known now that most Republicans in the Senate, they couldn't stand Trump. First of all, Trump was and always has been pro-abortion, but they put up with Trump because, as many speculate, to undo the balance of the Supreme Court and sway it in the Republicans' favor in order to do just what happened this week, and that is overturn Roe versus Wade. Now, by the way, who is Roe and who is Wade? First of all, Jane Roe, a name that is very close to Jane Doe, which is what you call someone when you don't know who they are. Actually, Jane Roe is really Norma McCorvey. She's a 21-year-old woman in Texas in 1969 who learned she was pregnant with her 3rd child. She didn't want to have another baby at her age, but she lived in Texas where the district attorney was Mr. Henry Wade. Now, at the time, Mr. Wade was well known for prosecuting people for having or performing abortions. So if Norma would have had an abortion, it would have been at the time a crime, and she could have easily gone to jail. This now in comes lawyers Sarah Weddington and Linda Coffey, who were looking for a young white girl in the same situation as Norma so that they could bring their case to court, and that woman saying that she should have a legal right to have an abortion. Well, after a long and arduous number of cases in the courts, eventually the case found its way to the Supreme Court, and in 1972, there was a 7-2 decision. Jane Roe won the right to choose to have an abortion. The court said outlawing abortion would infringe on a woman's right to privacy. In other words, having an unwanted child could force the woman into a distressful life and future, and it may bring imminent psychological harm, and that caring for the child may tax the mother physically and mentally, and because of the birth, maybe there would be distress for all those concerned associated with the unwanted child. But now, and this is where it gets a little tricky, a woman's right to an abortion must be balanced with the health of the woman and the rights of the fetus, so the court gave the states the right to impose the limitations on when a woman could get an abortion. In other words, in every state, a woman has the right to an abortion. However, the state decides if she can get it within the first trimester or the second or even the third trimester. It'd be up to the state that she was in as to when she could get it. So, as you could imagine, depending on whether the state was more Republican or more Democrat, decided when and how the woman would avail to terminate her pregnancy. Which goes to the root of this issue. When does life begin, and at what point can we terminate that life? There are so many factors here in regard to religion, background, economic status, even race. First and foremost factor is, when does life really begin? Some say the life of a human really begins inside the man, that the sperm is the first part of life. And then some say it comes at conception, when the egg is fertilized. And then some say it's when there's a heartbeat. And then, of course, some say when the baby is fully formed. And then finally, some say when the baby is actually born. Now, in some states, if you have an abortion in the second trimester, it's illegal. And in some states, if you have an abortion in the third trimester, it is legal. Which brings up the point, if the baby is terminated just before it's born, it might be legal, but then just after it's born, it might be murder. The implications of this whole case can make your head spin, but what happened this week is that any state can now deny a woman an abortion at any time during the pregnancy. And this is what Republicans have been fighting for the past 50 years. This is what they have fought for over and over in the courts for years, and the conservative minority in the U.S. has always lost. Even in 1992, when it was reaffirmed, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said, "Our obligation is to define the liberty of all, not the mandate of our own moral code." But the new Trump-appointed set of justices see it exactly the opposite. They believe that it's not a constitutional right, that the mother does not have the right to decide whether the tiny chromosomes in her womb is under her control. Now, interestingly enough, this will be the first time, the absolute first time, that a constitutional right in the United States has been revoked. Now, the concern is that the court overturning a woman's right to privacy and having a medical procedure to her body, which is now no longer her right, will lead to other rights of privacy being questioned, such as the right to privacy. Can two people of the same sex be married? And then, is there a right to birth control? And of course, is there a right to do whatever sexual acts you want to in your own home, which used to be illegal? But the question now is, are those in question because of what happened on Friday? Now, none of these that I have mentioned are in the Constitution, but then again, neither is the right to carry a gun outside of your property. These are unwritten parts of the Constitution because when the Constitution was written, these were not really issues. So this is an issue in which the Supreme Court has to interpret the rights that are based on the idea of the Constitution, not what's actually written. And so far, in 200 plus years, they have discovered new rights and made them laws because that's what made sense at the time. But this is the first time I can see that they are now taking away a right that they said made sense before. And it's a right that millions and millions of women utilize every year. The United States is the same place where people fought not to have to wear a mask during a medical pandemic. It's a country that prides itself on freedoms and rights. But now it's having one of its fundamental rights taken away. And who is this law going to affect anyway? I mean, if you're rich, you're a white person, you can get on a plane and you can fly to another state. You can get your medical treatment done because you can pay for it. But what if you're not that person? What if you're a poor mother living on welfare with 5 kids? You can barely feed the kids you have, and yet she gets pregnant. There's no way she can leave her kids and fly to another state and pay for an out-of-network medical cost. So she will have a choice of having the child or going to some illegal place set up to do abortions on people like her, which are dangerous and have no follow-ups. And what about miscarriages? Now, when someone has a miscarriage at home or in the hospital or in a doctor's office, it will need to be investigated because it very well could be illegal. This will be public record. I mean, doesn't this contradict a woman's right to privacy? This is something that people took for granted, never thinking that it would ever be taken from them. But elections do have consequences. Trump may have been ousted from power, but the legacy he left will live on. Right now, several states have banned abortion the moment the ruling came out. And more of those states will follow. Those laws will bounce back and forth from year to year based on who's in power in that state, which is going to make sometimes things very confusing. But one thing is for sure, the protests are coming and the sign-selling people are gearing up for the biggest sale of the last 50 years. And I can bet anything that even though the Supreme Court made its ruling, it's just the beginning of a fight that will probably never end. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. So just recently in Japan, President Biden of the U.S. made a statement that made many of us sit up and say, OMG, I didn't see that coming. Biden basically said any aggression towards Taiwan would be met with U.S. military force. I mean, it's one thing to think it, but it's another to actually declare it at a high-level international summit. Once he said it, he then directly linked the Russian-Ukraine conflict to the China-Taiwan conflict. Something we all thought, but I don't know, you might not say it, especially if you're the U.S. president. This really struck a nerve with many Chinese because the U.S. policy is that China and Taiwan are one country, not two. Even though the U.S. treats Taiwan as a single democratic entity, it's still, in the eyes of the U.S., one single country. But Biden said that China is currently flirting with danger and that Taiwan is under the U.S. protection, which seemed like a change from the long-standing one-country policy of the U.S. Now, in case you have been glued to your news channel, things are getting pretty hot under the collar between Taiwan and China in the past few years. In fact, there have been moments where someone almost took a shot at the other. And of course, the U.S. is right there, seemingly playing both sides of this. But why? Why is the U.S. so involved in this? And why is it so involved in the conflict? It seems to be more of a family squabble. So, just to get up to speed on this story, let's take a look at why this conflict has seemed to have gotten, so much worse in the past few years. And why is the U.S. so interested in getting in the middle of it? The best way to understand things is to go back in history a bit. Back to 1895, when China was trying to extend its rule across Asia, and one of those places it forcibly added to its collection was Taiwan. Now, at the time, they called it Formosa, and Japan had great plans for its new colony. They wanted it to be a model state for other Asian countries to see, so that maybe they might want to join up to the Japanese empire. So they raised the standard of living. They improved the education of schools. They brought in lots of new innovative infrastructure and created a healthcare system. So after 50 years of this Japanese rule, Taiwan became a very developed nation. But then came World War II, and unfortunately for Japan, they chose the wrong side. And after a few nuclear bombs from the U.S., they eventually had to surrender. Now, part of that surrender was to give back the island of Taiwan to the Republic of China. But then the Republic of China got into a fight with the Communist Party of China, and China split. The ROC going to Taiwan and the CCP staying on the mainland. Okay, they didn't exactly split. Each one claimed that China was not split, but that they were the actual ruler of China. But there was a problem. The ROC was forced onto Taiwan, which, after Japan left, was now a poor country with many, many refugees trying to survive. And a new replacement system really was needed there. So what did they do? They turned to the U.S. for help, and the U.S. did support Taiwan for a while, until 1960, when Taiwan made the decision to stand on its own feet. So they started making stuff, lots of stuff. cheap stuff that Americans would buy, and very soon they became an export economy. Now, Taiwan went from being a very poor place to a very not so poor place. And in 1980, Taiwan went from making tennis rackets and plastic action figures to making semiconductors, and that changed everything. Now, anytime you wanted to develop a computer or a game console, or phone, car, you really need to talk to Taiwan to get semiconductors to make the whole thing work. This made the relatively small country one of the top 20 richest countries in the world. But one other interesting thing happened in the 1980s. They became a democratic nation. After 40 years of being under authoritarian government of the ROC, democracy found its way through, thus truly establishing Taiwan's independence from Beijing. But even though Taiwan had kind of given up on the idea that they were the true rulers of all of China, Communist China had not given up on the idea. As far as they were concerned, Taiwan was still a region of China and theoretically still under the overall rule of them, the Communist Party. I mean, the Civil War from 60 years ago was theoretically still going on. I mean, neither side conceded, and even China has become a superpower. The U.S. has continued to back Taiwan, allowing it to keep its autonomy. But here's where it gets kind of complicated. During the Nixon years, the U.S. needed to have a good relationship with China because it was currently dealing with the Cold War with Russia. So what they said was, we acknowledge that Taiwan is part of China. However, we also at the same time accept the sovereignty of the state of Taiwan. So even though many nations around the world see Taiwan as an independent country, the U.S. sees its status as undetermined, whatever that means. So the U.S. sees Taiwan as part of China. However, the U.S. continues to trade directly with Taiwan and sells them very important military arms that Taiwan uses to protect itself against China. So basically, the U.S. has stayed in the middle, and this has pretty much kept the peace between the two nations until now. So why? Why all of a sudden China's telling Taiwan that there will be no divorce and it's now time to come home? Well, first thing is, Taiwan is a fairly liberal country. If you remember, they were the first country to adopt gay marriage. But the real sticky point here is that there's a very strong movement of young people in Taiwan that does not want China and Taiwan to be integrated in any way, especially not economically, as they have seen what happens to countries who deal with China in the past. Even if it might be good for some to integrate the China-Taiwan economically, it's not worth giving up freedom of speech, democracy, and independence. They saw what happened in Hong Kong. So now that the more liberal party has been voted into the power, the DPP, and the more conservative party has lost power, that's the KTM, things are separating more and more. The DPP said they would be willing to talk to China, but they will only do so as equal nations, which of course Beijing will not recognize in any way, shape, or form. But the big Buddha in the room is that China has been somewhat secretly building up a very mighty military, especially in the Navy, one that is so big that they have done something that we never thought possible. They have been somewhat standing up to the U.S. Back in history, anytime that China made any kind of advancement on Taiwan, the U.S. would drive by and tell them to get back in their own yard. But now, even though the U.S. keeps driving by, China doesn't always go home. They may run and hide behind a tree, but they don't leave like before. They stick around and fly their fighter jets right near the Taiwan airspace again and again. You know, as of 2016, China has cut all talks and diplomatic ties with Taiwan. And in 2019, they restricted all travel to and from Taiwan. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, as China lately keeps saying that soon it will reintegrate Taiwan back into the arms of its Chinese mother. And it will do so by force if needed. I mean, look at Russia. They're doing it. Why can't we? Which is another big egg in the roll. China has somewhat, but not officially, sided with Russia in its plight to take over the Ukraine. But currently, China has basically been standing back and just doing a kind of a wait and see. What they are seeing is that it's not so easy to take over a country when most of the world is backing that country, and they know that if they make a play for Taiwan, it may only be Russia that stands with them, if, well, Russia has any power left at all. Also, if they do a full-out military assault on Taiwan and Taiwan's microchip manufacturing were to collapse, what would that do to China's economy? Not to mention the rest of the world. China doesn't care so much about being isolated or sanctions because Putin really doesn't care because he's kind of crazy. But China's not crazy. Their economy is very important to them, and they are not going up against Taiwan, who has the U.S. and Japan, Australia, and probably the rest of the world at their backs, which leads to the Biden words of this past month. He said that we will make a deal with you, China, but if you try any kind of military strike on Taiwan, you're going to regret it. But here again, China has time. This doesn't have to happen tomorrow. And the world is changing. The more authoritarian regimes that develop, the better for China. And on the other side, the more democratic strongholds continue, the better for Taiwan. Many are waiting to see how the Philippines will fit into the new geopolitical Asian landscape, as they have turned out to be a bit of a tennis ball of sorts, bouncing from one side to the other. If Russia is able to pull off this overtake of a democratic nation, it will give China a much wider swing of its bat and may feel it's strong enough and has enough solid players to take a shot at Taiwan. The U.S. does not have the power it once did, and China knows that. China wants to ensue its dominance in Asia as it inches closer and closer to taking its big shot. But is now the time to jump in the water of an all-out war, or wait a few years from now? The only problem is, with waiting a few years, Taiwan may very well be stronger by then. Maybe even the U.S. will have gotten its act together. But also, who's going to be China's ally in the future? Is Putin's Russia going to be standing by them? And will the Philippines have made up its mind yet on who its friends are going to be? So even though the future is uncertain, one thing is for certain. This is Eric Lecain, and this is the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. We're talking about interesting stories that are going on around the world. Some of the stuff that has happened this week. You remember what you were doing back in 1977? That is, if you were born yet. I was in junior high school. I was one of those kids that was always experimenting. I loved science. I loved astronomy. I hated school, but I loved science and astronomy. I remember doing a report on the new spacecraft NASA was about to launch called the Voyager. For me, it was just cool beyond the coolest. They were sending a probe into space to search for life. It should fly out for about 4 years, but surely in that 4 years it would send back some great photos. Now, how could it last 4 years in space? Actually, it ran on a plutonium-based reactor on the probe that would power it all the way into deep space. But the ship didn't last 4 years, not 10, not 20. In fact, it lasted 45 years, and it's still out there, sending back data that we could have never imagined. But after scientists have continually been figuring out how to keep this thing going farther and farther into space, it's finally time to shut it down. Now that it's 21 billion kilometers from traveling and it's going at 61,000 kilometers per hour, it's losing power. Scientists have decided that now is the time to power down the Voyager. However, the probe can still continue on its journey, just without sending any more data to us. The signal that Voyager sends out is only around 20 watts, and it takes 20 hours for it to reach Earth. It's funny, by the time it reaches Earth, it's about a billionth of 1 watt. But still, that's enough for these giant mega receiver dishes to read it. There are actually 3 of these deep space 70-meter wide antennas located around the Earth. One's in California, one's in Madrid, and one's in Australia. These massive antennas pick up basic radio waves, just like your FM radio. However, they can pick up extremely weak signals. Like I said, it's more than a billionth of 1 single watt. Now, there are actually 2 Voyagers out there flying around in space. Both launched at about the same time. However, they're taking very different paths. Voyager 1 sent directly toward Jupiter and Saturn, while Voyager 2 verged off that path so we could get a good look at the other planets, also Uranus and Neptune. Because Voyager 1 was sent directly to Jupiter, it only took around 2 years for it to get there, and while it was doing its flyby, it took 1,900 amazing photos of the giant planet. This included the moons of Jupiter, which have brought discoveries that would have never been known, such as finding out that there's evidence of active volcanoes in our solar system other than us. But when it reached Saturn, some of the most spectacular pictures ever taken in space were sent back, including the discovery of 2 new moons. But once it passed Saturn, it basically was at the end of its mission. Now, it took several pictures of Neptune and Uranus, but before the cameras were shut down, the spaceship turned around and took a 60-frame photo of the entire solar system. It could see almost every planet, including an amazing picture of the Earth in 1990, which became known as the pale blue dot. And years later, in 2021, Voyager became the first object made by man to leave our interstellar space. And yet until now, still, it's able to send back data to Earth. Now, there is a computer on board, which is about a 70 kilobyte of data storage, which is about the size of, one picture that you may send on Messenger. But it's rather clever how this computer is able to record data on an old-fashioned magnetic tape drive, and it sends it back to Earth. Both Voyagers have exactly the same equipment on board, and in the last 40 years, the computers and magnetic tape drives have worked near perfectly. Now, the data transferred for each of the ships is around 160 bits per second. At that rate, it would take you about 8 years to download a Netflix movie, but somehow the computer systems, with all its limitations of today's computers, are still working and sending data back to NASA. But the most fascinating thing on board each one of these ships is a golden record, a copper record plated in gold, just like your standard playing record before, CDs came out. Contains 115 encoded photographs, a universal greeting in 55 languages, a 12-minute montage of sounds on Earth, and 90 minutes of Earth music. This is just in case somewhere out there were to find one of these ships and want to know a little bit about us. Even as the Voyager 1 is about to power down all of its instruments, it will still continue on its journey, even outside of interstellar space. It's given us information on the giant bubble that surrounds our solar system and even how it protects us from cosmic radiation from other places outside of our solar system. But this week, maybe one of the last communications we will get, as Voyager 1 passes out of communication range. Voyager 2 will follow on a different path into space, just continuing their mission to the next solar system. Supposedly, if they are not destroyed by deep space, each Voyager will come upon a new star in about 40,000 years. What a journey it's been for the Voyagers. Wouldn't it be cool to know what they will see next? I remember back in my report in junior high, but I never thought we would still be talking about the Voyagers even now. So as we say goodbye to the Voyager 1, we wish it well. Maybe one day someone or something will bring it back to us and say, hey, we played your record and at least your music is not bad. This is Eric Lecain on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. Our animal of the week is the sea sponge. So maybe you're asking, what exactly is a sea sponge? And is it really an animal? Well, whatever it is, it's a very important creature. They sit on the bottom of the seafloor and they pump out water and catch tiny particles, bacteria, and plankton, and algae. They recycle the carbon on the seafloor as well as provide shelter for marine creatures. They are the hotels and the street cleaners of the sea. But sadly, they are dying. I mean, dying by the millions. Scientists released their findings, and as it turns out, as the ocean heats up due to the carbon emissions and the greenhouse gases, it's throwing off the ecosystem around the world, especially in New Zealand, where there is one of the largest populations of sea sponges. The shocking discovery happened last month, in which scientists discovered that all the sea sponges in one area, probably tens of millions of them, had all turned white, which is something called bleaching. This happens when sponges become stressed with the warmer waters, and algae living in the tissues is expelled, causing them to turn white. Now, this doesn't mean that they are dead, but it means that they are sick and they're not doing their job, the job that they were born to do, which throws off the ecosystem in the water. Ordinarily, this would not be such a big deal if not for the fact that it was happening to millions and millions of sea sponges. One scientist who's part of the research team described it as looking at a white graveyard. Yes, last year was one of the hottest on record for the ocean. In fact, it was the third year in a row where the record was broken as being the warmest time in the ocean. So this bleaching event was not limited to just New Zealand, but also in Australia's Great Barrier Reef. It had a massive bleaching event. This will have been the 6th major bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef in recent years, and it's already killed more than half of the sea coral there. So you might say, well, so a bunch of sea coral died. It'll grow back, right? The problem is that all the animals that rely on the coral to survive, how many species could disappear or never return if their food supply runs out? And what do you think happens when fish food starts to run out and the ocean gets hotter? Well, the fish leave. There have been a trend in oceans as to where are the fish going? As many species as rockfish, Atlantic cod, sea bass are all swimming northward toward the poles, away from the waters where they have lived for tens of thousands of generations of fish. This, of course, is disrupting the normal fisheries in these areas as the fish are just simply leaving. Another interesting issue in rising seawater is the rising seawater. If you hear about the seawater rising, I don't know, it goes up, what, they said a quarter of an inch? Doesn't seem that big deal. It's just like that much. The problem is the wetlands, the places inland where plants grow both in and out of the water. The ocean may only rise a tiny bit in the ocean part, but it can have a huge impact on the seawater as it fills up the rivers and the streams inland. Much of the wetlands are simply drowning. The grass and the plants can't grow fast enough to keep up with the rise in water. Like I said, it may be going up a tiny bit in the ocean, but that tiny bit runs inside the waterways and it becomes much more than a tiny bit and causes flooding. Also, you know that the ocean these days absorbs about 22 million tons of carbon dioxide per day? That sounds great in theory, but the problem is it really supposed to be that much? So even though this is great for us, it's causing massive amounts of acidification. The ocean is like a giant swimming pool, and there's a pH level that must be maintained. Once that changes, once there is a higher amount of acidity, this will affect the calcium in the water, which is what fish use to build skeletal structures and their bodies, and how shells are formed on crustaceans. This is also the building blocks of coral reefs, where the sea sponges live. See, the ocean is a very cohesive environment in which many parts are relying on parts of other things to survive. Did you realize that the acidity issue directly reduces the amount of sulfur flowing out of the ocean into the atmosphere? This reduces the amount, slows the reflection of the solar radiation back into space. If the radiation is not reflected back, you know what happens? The Earth heats up even more. This is what scientists keep screaming to us about. If they were to, let this continue, there are things that will eventually happen that we cannot fix and we cannot reverse. I mean, what if the fish move farther and farther away because there's just no food, no shelter, and it's too hot in the water? Fish is a major part of human food supply, not to mention, it's how I get my sushi. And what if the coral continues to turn white? Yes, I know how much some humans want to turn white, but coral is much better being red or orange or purple or green. Once it's white, it can't flourish and spread as it's done for millions of years. Many of these species took millions of years to evolve, and humans are changing their environments in just a few years because we need to drive cars. Yes, we know that cars and factories make pollution, and we know we can curb that pollution with laws about greenhouse emissions. That's all very great and wonderful, but underneath the ocean, there are changes happening that no laws are going to fix. Once certain ecosystems are dead, they may not come back for thousands or millions of years. And as we are watching the glaciers breaking off in the waters of the poles and the deaths of the largest coral beds in the world and the whitening of our sea sponges, we have to ask ourselves, are those scientists yelling at us about how it's going to be and how it's going to be too late very soon? Are they kind of right? I guess from the point of the sea sponge, they are. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. We are talking about interesting stories going on around the world. So let's get back to these January 6 hearings that we keep hearing about. We talked about it before, but these hearings happen over several weeks long, and each one of the hearings has a different subject. Now, just a quick update. There is a committee of Republicans and Democrats investigating the attempt of an insurrection on the Capitol on January 6 to overturn the 2020 election. This we know. A bunch of Trump supporters overtook the Capitol on the day of the electors were supposed to name Joe Biden as the president. Now, as we have talked about before, Trump had falsely claimed that the election was stolen from him and that the vice president had the power to overturn the final count and make Trump the winner. However, Vice President Pence could not do this because it was against the law. We learned this by watching the hearings. Trump was telling him to do it anyway and sent the violent mob to the Capitol who were chanting the infamous words, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." Now, Trump and his supporters are saying this was not an insurrection. It was people protesting the stolen election, or they were just tourists. But as has been revealed in these series of hearings, it was anything but a group of raucous Trumpers or tourists. It was indeed an attempt to take over the government of the United States. Now, the latest hearings began to reveal the behind-the-scenes action of Trump and his people and how they had multiple ideas of overturning the election before the January 6th storming of the Capitol and killing anyone trying to certify the vote. They had multiple witnesses testifying in front of the committee trying to explain how they were pressured by Trump himself, by Rudy Giuliani, the Trump lawyer, by Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff. But the funny thing is, these people testifying in this hearing, they were not Democrats. They were hardcore Republicans, people that voted for Trump. What these witnesses showed was how Trump was trying on multiple levels to get the election overturned. How it was not just getting his people to storm the Capitol, but leading up to that day, trying to pressure officials into believing his conspiracy theories that the election was stolen. One of these Republican election officials in Georgia said that Trump's people kept giving him so many stories it was hard to keep them all straight. The main ones were that tens of thousands of illegal immigrants had somewhat managed to get past the incredibly hard voter registration in Georgia and cast all their ballots for Biden. Also, somehow thousands of dead people were voting, and that suitcases full of Trump ballots were being thrown out, that counting officials were secretly stealing the votes via USB drives. All of these were very stringently investigated because the ones investigating were Trump Republicans. They wanted to find anomalies of fraud. The problem was they couldn't find anything. They could not prove any of the Trump conspiracies. Now, when Giuliani, Trump's lawyer, met with Republican officials and said there are thousands upon thousands of illegal aliens voting, they asked Giuliani, do you have any evidence? And Giuliani said, yes, I do. I have evidence. And they said, can you please show us your evidence? And Giuliani said, well, we don't exactly have it with us. So they said, can you send it to us? And Giuliani said, yeah, sure I can. But then, of course, it never came. The woman they accused of handing her mother a USB drive in which it had Trump votes on it, it turned out it was actually a mint. Videos of the boxes and boxes of votes that were being stolen were not even votes at all. But the real evidence was Trump's phone call to the head of the state of elections in which he said, find me 11,000 votes. All I need is 11,000 votes. Find me the votes and you will be a hero. But even if they wanted very much to be the hero, there was still the problem. They have to show the evidence. But even with all this proof, there was a tape of one of the Republican lawyers saying that even if there was no evidence, even if we never found anything, I still believe the Democrats cheated. You know, that's a real eye-opener, isn't it? Because many people believe the same thing. Because even with no proof and multi-court cases lost by Trump's lawyers and Republican election officials that voted for Trump may not be able to find any evidence at all, many still not believe what's right in front of their faces. Because if you say something enough times over and over, and you post it on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, a lot of times people are just going to believe it. The things that Trump was doing to overturn the election was illegal. He knew it was illegal. As stated in the hearing, Giuliani knew it was illegal. But still, they tried to do the things they knew was illegal because it didn't matter as long as enough people believed it. The problem they had, though, was not enough Republicans in key positions would go along with the plan because they knew it was illegal. Trump called the Georgia state election investigator, telling her she needed to do anything and everything to make sure that these allegations were true because January 6th was soon approaching. There was a call to the Pennsylvania election officials in which Giuliani kept saying, we're all Republicans here, right? Meaning to say, come on, you need to take one for the team. Mark Meadows, Trump's own chief of staff, sent texts to Georgia officials offering them MAGA stuff, hats and shirts, just to make this happen. He's the guy that set up the call between the head of the elections in which Trump berated the guy, telling him that, well, Trump said, we won by 400,000 votes. But all he had to do was come up with 11,000. Only 11,000. Then Trump turns his sights on his own DOJ, telling them to just say the election was corrupt. Yes, he knew there was no evidence to back it up, but just say it in order to create doubt. Trump's main guy, Bill Barr, had just resigned, so he installed Jeffrey Rosen because Barr refused to turn over the elections based on a lie. The problem with Rosen was, he said there's no evidence to support these claims of voter fraud. They looked into all the claims that Trump made. They came to the same conclusion on all of them. Trump lost the election. So what was Trump doing was pressuring him and all of them at the DOJ that it doesn't matter if it's true. It doesn't matter if there's any evidence. Just say it. But he wouldn't. Which is when Trump tried to change the new DOJ to an even newer DOJ. But in yet another guy, Jeffrey Clark, who he was an environmental attorney, put him in just to say the election is stolen. Just say it. That's all you have to do. But what's interesting about all this is what would have happened if any of these guys had gone along with Trump's plan? What if they were all like, what the heck? Let's just say what Trump wants us to say. Unfortunately for Trump, his own guys would not go along with the plan. And once Trump no longer had the option, and the option of getting the Republican elections officials in Georgia and Pennsylvania to go along with his plan, well, it's then that he looked to a screaming mob on January 6th to storm the Capitol and kill the vice president and take over the country in a coup. And they tried that. And like others, it failed. And many of those Trump rioters, they got arrested. Which, by the way, after the last hearing, Trump made a speech. He said if he were elected again, he would consider pardoning everyone who was arrested in the Capitol riot. Well, that's interesting that he would consider it. But what the committee uncovered was how many Republican congressmen asked Trump for a pardon before he left office. Many congressmen who were part of the planning to overturn the election, such as Mo Brooks, Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Gomer Perry, all these guys that were spreading the idea that the election was stolen and all the conspiracy theories about the votes being changed, etc., etc. Now we're asking for broad presidential pardons to keep themselves out of jail if this whole thing went south. The committee brought this up, and the plan, they had to swap out the electors for fake ones. I mean, why would you ask for a preemptive pardon unless you believe you are in the midst of committing a crime? But what's even more interesting about this and that, things in the hearing, is that Trump's own lawyers, they were telling Trump's chief of staff and all the people working on this that what they were doing was illegal. In fact, all the Trump campaign lawyers, they would not go along with this scheme of pressuring campaign officials and trying to get fake electors sent in because it was illegal. But what was shocking was the fact that the state level officials who were taking part in the scheme of sending fake electors were told that this was all perfectly legal by the Trump officials, even though they were being told by their lawyers that it was not legal. This is what we learned, that later many of these state officials were asking Trump in the White House if they were going to cover their legal costs, if they were to go along with this crazy plan. Also, that the fake electors that Trump was getting some states sent to Washington, they were planning to hide in the Capitol overnight and then just appear in the morning so as not to have to go through security. And if this was not insane enough, when the Republicans had a hard time making the fake certificates that the fake electors would have to hand over, in steps Ron Johnson, the Republican senator who said he would hand Curry the fake documents to the Capitol for the fake electors to sign with their fake stamps. So there's a good reason for these pardons. But in the end, none of it worked. And now we are hearing the whole story. But many are asking, why do we need to hear all this? I mean, Trump's plan didn't work. Biden ended up winning anyway. I guess the reason is because Trump and his guys came really, really close to pulling this off. What if they had have taken over the Capitol? What if the vice president had been killed? What if Nancy Pelosi had been killed? What if AOC had been killed? Mostly what the committee is doing is making sure that this doesn't happen again, that there are laws in place to stop something like this from happening. Laws that we never thought that we would ever need. So that if Trump were to run again, which seems likely, he can't do what he already has said that he would do again. This is Eric Lecain here on the World News Jam on DZRJ and RJTV. We're talking about interesting stories going on around the world. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We will be back again next Sunday with more interesting stories. So please join us again. And for now, everybody be safe out there, and we'll see you then.
The view